So, hello everybody, and welcome, and whatever your time zone is, welcome to this Birds of a Feather session on republication and duplication of data, authority, identity, ethics. This is a late-breaking session which I submitted to RDA after the deadline for session proposals, because I thought this is a topic that really needs our attention, and there's things to discuss. And so we'll dive straight into it. But before we start, I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, sea and waters of the area that we live and work on across Australia, and acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The agenda roughly is that there's some opening and introductory words, and then we will have 4 short talks on different aspects that touch on republication of data. Kind of a pro position, a counter position, and then a lens on the question of authority and identity, and a lens on the question of credit and ethics. And then we'll open this to discussion, and that's the part where I think we will still need to work out how this works with so many participants. And of course, there will be closing remarks and some questions about next steps. If this BoF is a once-off, or whether this is something that merits continuation in some other group setting. Then one of the things is that, yeah, there's the minutes document, which it has been posted a few times now. It's also in the session description on the RDA website. So with digital data, the wonderful thing is that it's easy to copy them around. And you can store them in multiple places, and you can publish data through more than one repository or service. But doing so raises a couple of questions, like how can humans and machines know whether they are accessing an authoritative copy of the data? Is it trustworthy, or is it the one? Then if this is a mirror of the original data, how is the original source acknowledged? Who gets credit for the used and cited data? And when we look at the licensing terms, we want them to be as open as possible, because otherwise we create obstacles for reuse. But there are also cultural expectations that are tied to the way we share data that are not necessarily reflected in the legal code. And then if we replicate data in a different place, what needs to be preserved or replicated to preserve the quality standards of the original data? And I hand over to Mark from Figshare to present his perspective on data republication as a service, from a service provider's perspective. And I think I will have to unmute him. No, he's not muted. Yes, I can hear you. Do you want to take over the presentation, or do you want
if
to
I
go
could, that would be good. I think that would be good for sticking to my 5 minutes as closely as possible.
Yes, I will stop sharing then.
Perfect. And if I share my screen. Hopefully everybody can now see my screen. Shout out if not.
Wonderful.
Thanks for everybody coming along. I really didn't realize if this was going to be a big thing or a small thing due to the time differences, but I've seen people from my hometown of Liverpool on the call as well. So this is truly global. So for those who don't know, Jens, could you maybe mute as well while you're but I run Figshare.com, which is a data publishing platform. It's a generalist repository. I set it up to publish my own data sets back in 2011 when there was nowhere for me to make my data freely available in a citable way with the DOI. Since then, we've seen things like Zenodo come along and Dryad, which charges a fee. So the theory behind that was we bought into open data as a principle from the very beginning. As open as possible, as closed as necessary is a big line now, and I do believe in that. But everything on Figshare.com, the free version of the generalist repository, is either CC BY or CC 0. If somebody comes along and takes all of that data and puts it behind a paywall and makes it and tries to sell it, I see that as an imperative for Figshare to do a better job of discoverability and to keep us honest and to make our data openly available so that anyone can use it for any type. But in reality, what Figshare has evolved into is that we're a service provider. We provide repositories for organizations, institutions, publishers, the NIH, all of these folks. So we are now a service provider for all of these folks. That is how we make our business sustainable, our organization sustainable, and it means that we can give the free Figshare service available for all those other researchers like me who didn't have anywhere to put their data in the first instance. And so there is that free Figshare.com. So I'm going to be talking about what I think is, this conversation began as threads on Twitter about backing up content. And I'm going to explain the reasoning as to why Figshare is pulling content from other repositories. A note here is that we would love it if any other repository pulled a full copy of everything from Figshare. As I mentioned, it's CC BY or CC 0. Lots of copies keep stuff safe, so please do that. Where we see helping repositories, we work with data librarians, we work with librarians at universities primarily, and so we're not the only people working with that group of people. I wanted to highlight a few other areas what already exists in academia to help people with their libraries and with their repositories. So we're a repository provider. Unpaywall has taken a, which I think a lot of people know about, has taken the approach to help institutional repositories by helping them fill up their repositories with open access content. So they're saying, there's all of this open access content anywhere. Some's on, the Elsevier website, some's on PLOS website, some's on the Nature website. But you as a university want to have all of your papers in one repository, so you have a copy of everything that you've published and made openly available. So this is an existing thing that happens in academia. This has been going on for a while. And here is an example of a university that this is from the Unpaywall website. They mentioned Carleton University added 1,000 open access records, doubling their full text coverage, which is great. So here's a paper that is fully available in Carleton University. There's the download link of the PDF. So it's a copy of this paper. One of the things I'll say is that there is extra metadata on the Frontiers landing page that hasn't been pulled through into the metadata on the landing page on Carleton. And so there is room for improvement on what they're doing, but I still think it's a good thing that Carleton University have a copy of their paper. And if we look at papers in general, you'll see that this is the same paper in PLOS, which is showing up in Science Open, full text copy, ResearchGate, obviously, and then PMC. PubMed Central is essentially similar to Unpaywall there. It is a giant repository of all of this content that already has a home, but they're deciding to republish it on PubMed Central. And that same paper, you see it in the University of Sussex repository and also the Radboud repository. You'll see that it has a handle. So I think this is something that we should avoid with data when we're talking about data and moving it around the internet. I think we should always use the original DOI and not create a secondary ID for it, but I'm happy to debate that. So where we're helping repositories, well, this is an example of the Crick University where we're pulling all of their papers in from Europe PubMed Central. So that's an example where it's working with papers. But we also do this, this is just a little image off our website, which is all of the data generated from your university pulled into this repository where the university data librarians might want to mark up the content and the metadata to improve it, which is a conversation about who should be marking up the content. Just 2 more minutes. The reason why we do this is for data and pull it in from different repositories is if you look at papers that are citing data sets saying, here is my data set, that have put it on Figshare or Zenodo or Dryad or Pangaea, you'll see that there was about 20,000 of those last year. And from that, we can ascertain which universities those data sets are from. So you have 1,600 data sets for University of Oxford. So are we suggesting that University of Oxford has to go out and talk to every repository on the planet? Or is there a way that we as a service provider can give them those 1,600 data sets anyway? And in the terms of open data, I think the idea that we have bought into this, open data and content can be freely used, modified and shared for anyone for any purpose. If that is not the belief system of folks on this conversation, I feel that's a slight aside to what we're trying to achieve with republication. So in terms of challenges and solutions, which we're going to get to, I see it as metrics, metadata, and credit. So in terms of the metrics, make data count is something that we're signed up for, implementing at the moment, trying to make data a first-class research output. So then you would end up with, here's an example of a Pangaea data set where you see it's only got 32 views. Obviously, it's probably got more than 32 views around the world. So if make data count can give us consistent metrics, that'll work. The other thing I'd highlight here is we have citation counts using our sister company Dimensions. So we know about 17 citations of that data set on Pangaea. Pangaea, I don't think knows about it, or it doesn't make that information available on the website. So we can provide that back to them. So there's always ways to add more information. And just to wrap up, who owns this data? I think this is my real question for the group is, who is the owner? Is the publisher of that open access paper the owner? Is the author the owner? Is the university the owner? I think it's got something that's been muddled over years in academic publishing of papers. With Creative Commons license CC BY, you ascertain ownership as the author. With CC0, you're giving up, nobody owns that data, it's facts. The examples on the Creative Commons website actually highlight Figshare, which is nice. So 2 last bits on food for thought that from threads that started this conversation. So Todd Vision, who is one of the founders of Dryad, he says that having other digital libraries volunteer, backup and promote reuse of Dryad is more of a feature than a bug. And then just because, to play devil's advocate, so Todd Carpenter from NISO saying, do we need to educate people on what a license is? If there is this thing that people aren't buying into open, or they think they're buying into open, but not real open, then do we need to educate people and researchers more on what licensing means and how to use the licensing? So I think that's my last slide. Whose data are they? Do we want to limit the ways in which data can be used? And if so, why? And should repositories have a say in the way the content is used in the same way that nature could have a say in the way that the content is used by the authors who publish through them, and why? So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully I didn't go too over.
Thank you very much. I will continue straight away with the next talk by Robert Huber and Anna-Surya Devaraju. Unfortunately, neither of them can join us on this call, on the next one. So I'll try my best. And that should be visible now. So this is going to be a bit PowerPoint karaoke. So Pangaea in its history always put a lot of emphasis on machine interoperability of their data. And so there's a lot of human readable metadata on their pages, but there's also a lot of metadata that's available for machines that can be harvested through various forms. And so when other systems pull data and metadata from Pangea, then this is made available, and then but the different systems show it in their specific way. And for instance, down in the right-hand side corner, there's how Google Dataset Search presents data, and because they have a very limited scope of what they harvest and what they're interested in, it's also a very limited way the data are displayed compared to the rich display at Pangea. But what it does do is that this machine accessibility improves visibility. What is important, though, is that there should always be a proper attribution of the source and reference to the quality of the data and metadata, because when you want to reuse the data, you have to have some indication of where it is from and how, and quality metrics that tell you whether this is fit for use and fit for your purposes and the intended purpose of this data set. This is where the domain repositories come in, that they have this expertise of providing this contextual information to data that helps researchers assess the quality of the data they're downloading, which is difficult when you go to a domain agnostic repository that doesn't have the capacity to assess all these domain specific requirements and attributes. So when you put this into domain context, you can then offer much richer services than just discoverability. You can add visualization and analytical services that create a richer experience and a better way to assess whether this is something that you would want to reuse. So that is what I hope that they want to say. And I will now hand over to Leslie Wyborn. And need to find my, oh yeah, yes.
Hi. Okay, can you move my slides on as I asked?
I can,
because
yes.
I'm just a bit unreliable with my home setup. I just want to give a case that I've been working on for a couple of years, and I think it illustrates the point. And although I've called this the crime, it's not really a crime, and I think this is all unintentional. I think what has happened is, since this project started over a decade ago, the capability of the web, our expectations of it have advanced, but we haven't kept up with our data sets or how we're referencing it. So just quickly, ASTA is a satellite launched in 1999, and the Japanese Space Systems Group take the data off the instrument and process it to level 1 and 2. There was an Australian initiative with multiple organisations, including led by CSIRO and Geoscience Australia, were involved in it. And they created a continent-wide ASTA mosaic. From that, a series of products, the level 4 mineral maps, were made. And then each one of those mineral maps was made available in 3 different formats that related to being able to have the data available scientifically, and they're about 80 gigabytes, or there's a much more reduced GIS GeoTIFF version. And then over time, these things are now available from at least 10 different websites. Next. Next slide. Now, I work for the group in the yellow, and because we produced this NetCDF version, and I was trying to work out oh my God, you know, what's the credit? Who do I acknowledge? Blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't work out what was going on. So this is just a taste to give you an idea of how many data sets are involved in what we call the full path, going from the ASTA mission through to the products available for everyone to download from the web. And I'll explain those work, expressions, manifestation terms next. So next slide, please. So the scenario I was faced with is, here's the GA website and here's the Digital Earth Australia. And I'm not being critical of it, but there's the product, the satellite Earth map, and there's a landing page and a DOI. Now I can get into this Digital Earth and bypass the catalog, which has the landing page. But when I go to that landing page, the same data set now has a different DOI. More importantly, when you look at some of the products, so if you see there's a product notes, they're available on both sites. CSIRO, one is in the publication, full details about it and a DOI. In contrast, when I go to this, which is an exact copy of the source one from the CSIRO website, if you look up the top, you can see that it's got a ga.gov URL. And you then, sorry, this isn't very clear, but it's copyright Geoscience Australia by a CC BY 4 license. And so coming through this, I have no idea that CSIRO and the geological surveys and everybody else was involved in producing it. Now, I gave you a taste of all these different versions and trying to relate them because it was a nightmare. And so next slide, please. What Jens and I did, because he worked with it on me, was we went back to some really old-fashioned library work, and this is work from 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, by the library community, in which they said, if you look at the group 1 entities, you start out with a work, it's an abstract, it's the idea you're going to do something, which was the ASTA mission. And then from that, we had the level 0 raw instrument data that we did all the calibration, blah. Then we produced the scientific mosaics, and from that, we generated the products. And so, if you like, we had the original mission, and then we had all these expressions of the data from that mission in terms of levels of processing and scientific research. Then we produced the 17 maps. Each one of those maps were then manifested as either VSQ, NetCDF, or GeoTIFF format, and then made available, as I said, on up to 10 websites. And you're ending up with 2 different DOIs, a CC BY to Geoscience Australia or to CSIRO, the states, and everybody else. And so a user comes along and there's no credit anywhere for who did what where. The other thing that FERBA does is it talks about roles, which can be either a person or a corporate body. And I think this is interesting because it's differentiating between the owner of the data, who produced it, who actually made the product, and who created the original mission. And so if you put those 2 conceptual models together, moving on to the next slide, please, Jens. What we're arguing is you can kind of clearly see now who played a role in the full path of the development of this data. Now, I like the term full path as opposed to data lifecycle, because each one of those objects or expressions has its own data life cycle. But more importantly, by judicious use of identifiers and in the metadata, distinguishing between, owner, creator, producer, these roles, all of which are the, say, ISO 19115 metadata, at each, if you like, bus stop on that path, we can start to have full credit and attribution. But what's more important, and again, this is a big argument, that some of us believe each one of these down to the item level should have a separate DOI. Whereas some groups, so like if you go to the Geoscience Australia website, they just have one DOI for the NetCDF, the BSQ, and the GeoTIFF version. And so then what I find, if I go to that DOI, I don't really know which version was used in the analysis, who did what, who gets credit, who gets attribution. Okay, and so really, I guess what I'm saying, you're not saying whether it's right or wrong or what you should do, but by following this conceptual model developed for libraries, for books, and for music, we actually have a digital analog of it, which helps us start to be able to tag each one of the versions that are around. And so even if the same versions are copied, so if you look at the items, you can see that in pink, the CSIRO portal and the Digital Earth have exactly the same files. They're a copy of each other. But right now you can't trace that through any means. Okay, so I guess that's it. Oh, sorry, I'll just go one thing. Mark's, is there a metric that would justify a repository's existence? I'm arguing that NCI being able to put an identifier on this data set that they've got, that they kind of produced, is justifying our existence. Whereas if we are just the data sets copied all over the place, then we're getting no credit for the work that went into producing the original piece of work. Okay, I'm definitely stopping now.
Thank you, Leslie. I will now hand over to Kira. Kira, do you want to?
If you're happy to keep handling the slides, that's probably easiest.
Okay, I'll do that.
Okay, so representing a publisher, I guess here, sort of looking at this from a broader perspective. What struck me was that the conversations that came up around this situation in Twitter in December was that they're not really new conversations. There's been situations like this in a lot of contexts where permissive licenses have been used and where CC BY licenses have been used and where people who've published the data or shared the data or content of any kind have been upset with what other people have done with it. I think an interesting one is this case of Yahoo selling prints of CC BY photos from Flickr, and there's a photographer there who says, I now have to choose whether to prevent people from using my photos or prevent Yahoo from selling them. Personally, what I find interesting about this sentence is the use of the word now, because it implies that the person who used the license didn't understand when they chose that license that this was the decision they were making. There was also the Knowledge Unlatched case with Open Research Library last year, where they were republishing a lot of open access books and selling various services to access those books when in fact they were free in a lot of other platforms. And then a quote that I'll keep the person who said this anonymous, but a friend at CUP said, well, what's to stop us putting, for example, Elsevier's CC BY content on our platform? Only partially joking, because in reality, legally, we could do that. Any publisher could take anyone else's CC BY content and republish it on their own platform. And so I think the thing that came out of conversations I had with people internally and externally was that the ethics around data reuse and republication are kind of the same as any other reuse when we look at what happens with permissive licenses. So next slide. That said, my personal view is strongly that we still should be using permissive licenses wherever possible. I mean, they exist for a reason. And people may disagree with me. This is a discussion session, right? So feel free to tell me that I'm completely wrong, but the reason we have Creative Commons was to simplify and facilitate the reuse of content. And we know that any kind of license restriction, for example, for non-commercial use, is going to have a serious chilling effect on what people can do with content. And if we're advocates for open data and for the reuse of data, then we really should be thinking about trying to keep this use of permissive licenses as much as possible. And I think I still find the Dryad argument that's linked here in the slides, which I assume will be circulated later, quite compelling, which is that community norms and ethics are distinct from licensing, and that even if a license permits you to do something, it may be seen as unethical and inappropriate by the community. And in fact, a lot of what we do in research and in academia and in reuse of data is based on community norms rather than what's strictly permissible by licensing. So next slide. So I do wonder whether we need to have a bit of expectation management then. because the reality is that opening up data or any kind of content for reuse means that anyone can use it for any purpose. Mark made this point, and that's absolutely true. And I think that sometimes my experience with the RDA is that because we're so keen on making the data available for reuse, we sometimes gloss over maybe the potential downsides in quotation marks here, the potential for, if you make the data available, someone might use it for something that you don't want them to use it for. And I do wonder how aware typical researchers are of this risk-benefit trade-off, because there is a fundamental tension between making content as available as possible for reuse for good reasons and the risk that someone might use that content in a way that you're not happy with. And so I've got one more slide. Next slide. And I think the question of what constitutes ethical reuse and credit, I think Mark talked about ownership of data, but I'm not sure that's really the most relevant question. I think what people are interested in is getting appropriate rewards and appropriate sort of compensation even for their work. And what constitutes an appropriate reward depends on who you are and what your needs are within this context. I think for researchers, they're almost certainly most interested in citations. And for a researcher, frankly, I don't think they care whether someone who cites their data found it through Pangea or Figshare or somewhere else, or anyone else who's republished it. As long as they get the citation, that's the value to them. But I think there was a couple of questions raised in the chat here about traffic to repositories. And I know as a publisher of literature, certainly what's really important to us as a nonprofit is that we see the traffic and we see the usage on our platform and on our website, because that's what we use to demonstrate value of our content. And that's what feeds into things like conversations with funders and subscribers. And it's great that Make Data Count is trying to work on that. I think that would be great. But at the moment, I think that is probably the biggest interest of repositories, is making sure that they have ways to demonstrate value and that they get appropriate credits and reward for the work that they do to help publish and curate and make available the data. So not really many answers in any of that, but I think these are the interesting questions that we could discuss in this session. And that's all from me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the contributions into the chat. There are a lot of questions, and I try to follow them while managing the slides and trying to come up with a good question to start the discussion. So, Kira, sorry to put you on the spot here. It seems you also followed the discussion in the chat. And was there something that struck you as an issue that we really need to address to address this tension between licenses and cultural expectations?
I'm just trying to catch up on the chat and everything that people said while I was talking. But yeah, I think there's a point that a few people seem to have said that, yes, licenses don't really manage community culture. And I think that, yeah, I think having read through the Flickr case where Yahoo acquired Flickr and then started selling prints of openly licensed content, and there was a massive outcry from the community because although this was legally permissible, it just wasn't done. And there was an understanding that it wasn't done. And I think that those sorts of community norms can really help to make sure that people treat this sort of republication ethically. But I think someone's made the point that there are different ethical norms in different communities. And I mean, frankly, we can't avoid the issue that there will potentially be bad actors. I'm certainly not calling anyone involved in this a bad actor, but there could be malicious actors who will go and maliciously exploit content. So that's where I think we come back to the question of expectation management and maybe talking about the fact that, yes, when you make your content open, you do potentially open it up to malicious reuse, but the benefits, we think, outweigh the risks, and the benefits to open research and open data are potentially worth doing this. Or at least maybe we should have that discussion more explicitly.
What I still find interesting is that you use the term of malicious reuse, and is that really the concern, or isn't the concern rather that researchers need to distinguish themselves, and so they need the recognition to be recognized as the author, the producer of this wonderful data set that underpins so many important works, and
Yeah, so certainly from that perspective, I mean, look, I'm 100% in support of open data personally. That's my perspective. And I do agree that for the researchers, the important thing is that they are recognized for what they've done, that their work is cited. I'm just thinking of conversations I've had with our sort of sales and business development teams where their biggest fear is that some third party is going to go and scrape all of our open access content, republish it on a separate website. Nobody's going to ever come to our platform anymore. And therefore, we'll have no way to demonstrate that our content has value because we don't see the traffic, we don't see the reuse, we don't see the numbers. And I think that's a concern that probably other publishers of content, including data, might have. So not necessarily malicious, but yeah, I think that's a risk that a lot of sharers of content might have.
Mark, you made a case of why making data available through many portals is beneficial, and how do you address those kind of tensions?
Yeah, I think the great thing about this conversation is, you know, with such a wide audience, then you get the different stakeholders in. I think it'd be useful to understand where some of the questions are coming from, as to understand what is feeding the their perspective on it. Because if you work for a repository that needs to have high view counts to sustain itself, then you're going to have one opinion. If you're a researcher and you care about credit, then you're going to have another opinion. And so I think that's really interesting. The viewpoint that we have as a service provider obviously covers a lot of that, because, you know, the use case of unpaywall that I used, which is the same model that we're doing on behalf of our clients, I see that as, I don't think anyone sees unpaywall as a malicious actor in this space. And so when a repository when we have a university repository and they say, well, we want all of the content in their repository, that's their opinion, and they have that because they want as many metrics as possible to justify the data repository in their university. And then when we have things like the NIH repository that we do, people say, why would I use the NIH repository over just free Figshare? And it's because it's curated content, it has metadata improvement going on by professionals, and so there's a value add there. I think one of the things that repositories may get better at with the FAIR conversations is understanding, you know, how fair is this? Findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable for humans and for machines. Badges could help that. I also think that, you know, this idea of one thing that we don't consider when we talk about open data and the conversation with researchers, and Kira was referring to this, is, you know, researchers care about getting credit and getting impact. And we, as for the free Figshare.com, we made a decision that we would only allow people to make data under CC BY and CC 0. If you go to any of our other university repositories, that's their repository. They can choose whatever licenses they want. But we know that if you give people more restrictive license choices, then they will use those more restrictive licenses. So if somebody says, hey, I want to upload something to Figshare, but I want it to be CC BY NC, I say, go and use Zenodo, because they support that, and we don't want to give people the option. And there is an option if you have to do that. There is an option with Zenodo as well.
Yeah, and I will add to that. I do still find Dryad's argument for forcing CC 0, not even CC BY, but CC 0, I find it quite compelling. They do make good points about the limiting factors of even attribution. And I think that's a genuine point to be made of reuse of data. But I think when a situation like this arises, where someone then goes and uses the data in a way that perhaps not everyone is happy with, then we sort of run to this tension between, yeah, the issues of making the data as available as possible and people wanting to have some control over it. And I feel like, yeah, in circles where we promote open licenses and permissive licenses, maybe expectation management could help with avoiding these sorts of situations where people get upset about what happens. What do you guys think?
I'm trying to read all the questions fast enough.
Yes.
Coming in.
I'm trying to follow this as well.
It's hard to pause.
I did see someone making the point that if nobody goes to a publisher's website, maybe there's no point in having a publisher website.
Wow. So, and this is the thing as well. I think there's, when you talk about, there's all obviously a sliding scale on these things. And when you say, you know, I've forgotten the word you actually used, but the idea that malicious intent, you know, and so there's a sliding scale. There's people wrapping up content and reselling it. And there I see, you know, that idea of, I see it as if people start doing that with Figshare content, then I'd see it as a, you know, a kick to say you're not doing your job good enough if people can't find it, and that you're not doing your job good enough. But then with publishers, if you had a publisher who took everything from another publisher and put it on their website, then most publishers have adverts on their websites these days. So you could argue that they're monetizing it, and then that's a grayscale. And I think with data, we're still before all of that. I think the examples I showed of aggregators of papers, you know, Science Open and PubMed, they don't have adverts on it. They're not, they're trying to aggregate content in a way that people can consume the content. And I think that is a difference here. And just to put the cat amongst the pigeons as well, I think all of these problems aren't solved, but I think, you know, by the ideas of credit and normalizing metrics, if you normalize metrics and just say, it doesn't matter where I find the information on the internet, this person with this ORCID published this data set at this repository and had all of this impact. I think that's solvable.
So I want to take a slight segue now towards Leslie Wyburn's point about making data more usable. And that is that a legitimate case? And how should this be done to give credit to the originator? And what is then the role and the credit of the republisher publishing data set in a new format?
I mean, yeah, in that case, we've put effort into making it more usable in high performance environments, but we're not getting any credit for it, and we don't appear in the catalogs, etc., etc. And that's where you start to question, you know, your value. So it's a different use case from somebody republishing an existing data set. It's someone making a data set more usable.
Well, many would claim that.
What's that? Oh, many
would claim that.
We put it in a slightly different format. I mean, there's no way it was the same version as what we picked up. Sorry, we didn't pick it up. We were actually asked by the community to do this.
So one of the things that we started the discussion around the ASTER data many years ago, with the first question of how do we solve this from a data modeling perspective. And that was when Ferber came to the scene for the first time for us. And I think, and in many conversations, there's still an ambiguity about what we're actually talking about when we're talking about something appearing again on the internet as some version. And maybe the proposal that we published through the data versioning working group helps us develop a terminology around what is happening, how data reappears and morphs and changes, and what we mean when we talk about versions. And maybe using a better terminology will help us unravel some of these different conflicts around data republication, where some people feel that they're getting shortchanged. Just also trying to check the chat to see if there's something that we should definitely pick up.
I'd pick up that one from Graham Parton, who is the originator, though, the authors, the publishers, the distributors. that then goes back to, you know, further, and I think in DataSite has a whole list of roles that people play. It's just not a one-to-one. Here is a data set, there is one person.
Sorry.
We need to be clearer on the roles that are now increasingly involved in publishing a data set, particularly the large ones.
Yeah, I was actually looking at that point as well, and I would say that again, like the owner is not really the right question. I think originator is not necessarily the right question to ask in terms of credit, because I think authors, publishers, distributors all put effort into making sure the data is available and accessible, and all ethically should receive credit that's appropriate to the work they've done. And again, we talk about authors, probably the credit comes in the form of citations. For a publisher or distributor, the credit might come in the form of traffic to their platform and them being able to demonstrate that the work they've done is valuable to the community in whatever form that may take. So I think it's not, as you say, it's not a one-to-one question. I think it's a matter of understanding all of the stakeholders who are involved in making data available, whether that's through publishing or republishing, and making sure they all get appropriate credit for the work they've done.
Yeah, and I think there's another group that's starting to come in on this, and they came out quite loud at a meeting I was at with the, you know, that Enabling Fair Data project, and that's the funders. And what they're now saying is if an attribute, you've got the grant ID or the funder, then they can start to see the impact of what they have funded moving through the community in terms of usage of the data, number of papers, and then if you've got a high impact paper, by being able to link to a paper with a high you know, citation rate, you start to see the value of where they put their money. And it's kind of a new use case that's coming in, mainly because it is feasibly possible to do that through judicious use of identifiers.
And yeah, I do think, just to follow on from that, that the idea of fair data involves machines being able to read the grant codes so that you can just say, give me everything associated with this grant code and see if they've complied with what they said they were going to comply with.
Yeah.
I think
Sorry, carry on.
I was just going to ask opinions on where I see a gap in this space, because I think there's things going on like Make Data Count, which will solve some of these issues, or at least go some way to normalizing them. And one thing that I do see happening and can see happening is there is an output or a data set that's published on Zenodo. A university wants it in their repository, but they say, actually, I can mark up the metadata a bit better here, and I can improve the quality of the metadata, and I can add to it and make it more fair. Or we do have the use case as well where subject-specific repositories, government repositories are pulling through data and saying, we can add to this with some other data sets that we're aware of, and we're marking up the information using machines to say, well, we can also link this to some other linked open data and enhance it that way. But the original metadata index that is used for a lot of places is the data site. When you mint the DOI, you mint the metadata. So some kind of updating of all of the metadata for an object. What is this idea of what is the best metadata we have? I think that is something that's not being addressed in any way. And there might be better metadata versions. There might be better metadata around the data set out there, but it's not being indexed in Google Dataset Search because that's being pulled from DataSite or somewhere else.
Like that sounds like a question for the data versioning group. That
No, we're closing them down.
Yeah,
I'll leave the fate of the data versioning group and anything coming from this discussion to a little bit of discussion later and tomorrow on whatever it is in your time zone in 12 hours time. But another question I'd like to ask is, when we talk about data, we still often pretend we're dealing with small handcrafted data sets where a lot of blood, sweat, and tears of a researcher has gone into crafting this table. But is this still the reality? This is not all of our reality. Copying a small data sets around is easy. But one of the things that we're also getting interested in is the big data sets and the compilations. And I think that then asks new questions when when these larger data sets get made available through services, what's happening there? What's happening there about credit and attribution?
I mean, do you mean amalgamating lots of data sets into one enormous data set, or do you mean things like the square kilometer array, which may not just be, you end up with these physics papers with 800,000?
No, I'm not. I wasn't thinking of the physics or astrophysics data or papers, rather the kind of aggregations of many data through somebody who creates a value-adding service that harvests data from different places and then creates a large data set, or Internet of Things as a source of data, but where it's not about downloading it so much anymore, but rather using a service. And then this question of identity and attribution to the source might become important, where you want to know, where did this come from? I saw a blip here that I'm not sure whether this is real. I want to follow this on.
Mm-hmm. There's a few people in the chat. So Steve Jones saying, "Can I chip in with an example?" Greg Park, good comments on the Earth Systems Grid Federation.
Let me find
I have to admit, I was thinking also about text and data mining as an analogous example, and Manuel's brought that up as well. Because I mean, if you're doing a text and data mining kind of project and you have hundreds, thousands of data sets or journal articles that you've analyzed, I mean, is it sensible or reasonable to try and give credit to all 100,000 journal articles that you've analyzed in your data set? But okay.
So
but I'd be interested to see Steve's example as well.
Yeah, Steve, if you could use the raise your hand feature in your profile, then I can hopefully find. Oh, there you are. Yes. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. So I have done some work with the SOCAT project, which collects globally all of the surface ocean CO2 data. And that comes from all scientists all over the world. One interesting thing that's come up is that, I mean, for a start, SOCAT keeps all the individual data sets as individual data sets and gives credit back to the originators, the original PIs, but also there is obviously the overall kind of data set. One thing that repositories have brought up is the fact that because this is the place where all of the CO2 data is available for the ocean, nobody actually bothers to go and get the data from them, because they just go to the SOCAT project and download that. And the credit ultimately goes back to the PIs, but the repositories involved kind of the original data just aren't seeing any of that traffic. So, you know, that's a perfect example of a composite data set kind of taking over from the individuals completely.
So how does the community react to that, besides going to the composite data set?
The scientific community it is actually a community project, because back in, I don't know, this is about 10, 12 years ago, the community realized that there was a global need for this product, and they kickstarted the whole thing themselves. So they're all completely on board with its existence and its use. So it's kind of unusual in that sense that it's led by the scientists.
So, but you said that that the original repositories are in this way bypassed because people don't download the data from.
Potentially, yes. So there is a project that is being set up in Europe to basically harmonize these observation activities across Europe. And it's great, you know, all the European sites are putting their data into there, but it's also all going into SOCAT.
Okay.
So that European project is just never seeing any of the traffic, because ultimately they have a small percentage of the total available data. So why would anyone go there?
Okay. So, Mark, I understood that you are involved in a project about harmonizing data metrics.
Yeah, that's the Make Data Count service. It's coming out of DataSite in the California Digital Library. Daniela Lowenberg is heading it up, and that is trying to normalize metrics in the same way that, you know, people use Counter for papers, but also trying to roll them up in a way that you can say, how many views has this object had across all of these areas? How many downloads has it had across all of these areas? I mentioned citations in the chat before. I think citations is an important one, particularly for researchers, but people will be measuring citation counts in different ways. We already see it with papers and Web of Science or Scopus, or Google Scholar will give you different counts on, and researchers just want the highest count. They just want the highest count of citations. So I think that the citations conversation will be one that comes up more as we go. But I think if all repositories get involved with Make Data Count, then we can get further with normalizing one of these issues. I think this conversation is proving that there's a lot of different issues that need to be addressed. So RDA is the exact right place to be having these conversations. It's just what are the follow-ons in order to try and achieve that?
Here's a question that I just saw in the chat from Kai Naumann about packaging issues. And Kai, if you would like to explain what your question is about.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. What me as an archivist, what I'm interested about is what measures you have at the research data community to package the data sets you're talking about. You've given me plenty of examples on what data you're talking about, but is there any agreed ways of packing all the things that belong to the data set into one package that you can checksum in order to have the authoritative package that you can prove your authorship on?
Okay. Yes, that is a good question, and it has come up many times.
I can restate it if you like.
Yeah. Well, so your question is about, is there a way to package everything into one container or object that contains all the elements that make up this data set, and because it's in a unit, because it's all one object now, you can checksum it, and in this way make sure that you're dealing with the authoritative object. And so if it moves somewhere else, you can checksum it and find out that this is still complete, like it is done with software distributions, for instance.
Right.
I think from an archival perspective, it is something that works, but from a service perspective, not necessarily. And the Asta example, I think, is quite good in illustrating the different levels this has. So when you go down to the item level of the individual files, you can check some of the files, given that you don't change the encoding, because that changes the checksum. But what on the citation level, I think that's where the notion of the work comes in. I think there's what researchers are really interested in is the recognition for their work, rather than somebody being able to check the checksum on the file that's used for the distribution.
Yeah.
So the different levels to this discussion.
I agree with that. It's not legal, and it's not about great. It's not financial. It is rather a cultural thing. So that you don't really need checksums or digital signatures or that kind of stuff.
It depends on the use case. There might be use cases where being able to check the integrity with technical means is very useful. In the framework of this discussion, it doesn't though address the attribution aspect. But it is a good point that the dynamic data versioning working group also considered in their recommendations.
Yeah, thank you.
I was just looking at the chat again, and I think Carla raises an interesting point about citation and says that, assuming author 1 creates dataset 1, author 2 uses dataset 1 to create publication 2, let's say. Publication 2 is massively popular, cited, massively important, cited by all sorts of people. Author 2 gets all the citations for their publication, whereas their work is the only single place that cites the original author 1's dataset. And does this mean that author 1 is getting appropriate credit? And I think that what this reminds me of is if you look at the DORA, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, and their idea that you should cite the original works or the original publications of some information, not, for example, a review article that cites a bunch of original works, so that the original authors who published that research should get the credit. I feel like, again, this is the same sort of issue that we've seen in a lot of other parts of academia and in terms of credit for research. It's not unique to data sets. I think this is a problem that exists in other kinds of content as well. Sorry, I just thought that was an interesting point, but
I agree with that, Kira. And just as an anecdote on that, we have had somebody, in this kind of strange world of why, when I was a researcher, my PI always used to be saying, why is our biggest competitor not citing our papers when they're obviously, using them? And it's like, well, we know why they're not, because they're your biggest competitor, and that's the way the academic system works.
Yep.
But we have actually had people get in touch with us and say, can you contact people and say that this is the original source that you're looking for, and you should have referenced it. We have had a case where someone has updated a paper to include a reference, but I think that is the edge case in that one. But
yeah, for sure, that doesn't sound like it happens a lot.
No, exactly.
But I mean, that's again comes back to sort of, well, it's the community norm. I mean, whether or not you cite a paper is less to do with whether you're legally required to, and more to do with where you ethically feel it's appropriate, and whether you have other push factors that would encourage you not to cite it, for example.
Yeah, we have something quite meta on Figshare, which some of these topics cover is what if I wanted to group together a load of content that has already been published. So I want to group together, here is the 20 climate models that I used in order to generate my data set. How do I cite that? And so we have the idea of what we call collections, but you can ignore the term. And the question was, if I collect all of these data sets and add some metadata, should that be a citable unit? And we decided it was, because if you're a curator of poetry, books, then you are the author of that book, even though the works may be by individual individual poets. So we give the option, which is cite this collection or download a file which has the citations of all of the references for all of the files in this list.
Yeah, I mean, the book analogy works. If you talk about curating poetry, you have added value in theory. If, you know, put the effort in to create a collection and to put together something that has a theme or whatever and should be cited for that work. But yeah, then if the original authors of that poetry are not getting citations whenever your hugely popular poetry book gets cited, is that really ethical? Are people getting the appropriate credit that they should ethically deserve?
And I think that the point there is, you said they are adding value in theory. And again, this is why I was interested in hearing where everybody.
I didn't mean to mean that to sound like demeaning. I just like.
No, yeah. Apologies to all the poetry curators out there. But this idea of in theory is all, you know, an opinion. And so in terms of a debate, all we can base our decisions on, and well, all we can present is if you have facts, then it's a lot easier to present facts. But a lot of the people in the conversation at RDA have opinions based on the role that they serve in their working field or their interest. And so I think that's where a lot of the gray areas come from. And so facts is a good starting point, and then we can get into the gray areas, I feel. So many great examples. It's a shame this thread will not be preserved anywhere.
Does Zoom not preserve this? That would be a shame.
Well, maybe, yeah. Could put it into some notes and
select all and copy.
Yeah.
Jens, is that correct? I thought, or Ming? Can't we save the chat or?
If it's recorded, then all discussions will be saved.
So is it being recorded?
In a separate file. Yeah, we are
being recorded, yes.
Yeah, it's being recorded. And I think with select all and copy, I think it should be possible to copy the chat, I hope, because it's really, really interesting. Thank you so much.
You can save the chat by clicking on the 3 points on the right-hand side. There's the option to save.
Oh yeah, this says save chat. Fantastic, thank you.
I think again, just looking at the chat, just back to that example of, for example, you know, the second author uses the first author's data set, creates a hugely popular work, and that's cited instead of the first author's data set. I think it was Graham has brought up the point that ethically, shouldn't the second author invite the first author to be a co-author on their hugely popular paper? Ethically, maybe yes, but is that the norm in all communities?
It can also be the other way around, that a data set, that a paper provides a really useful data set, and in this way becomes really popular. But the reuse never actually makes use of the original paper, just the data. And so as another anecdote, in my PhD, I made a lot of use of the Dansgaard et al. Greenland ice curve for climate, as a climate proxy. And so I use those oxygen isotope values against time as to tune my age models, but otherwise the Dansgaard paper wasn't relevant to what I was doing. But it was another couple of citations to Dansgaard's work. So,
sorry, just apologies. That was Steve that said that, not Graham. Steve Jones said that one. I'm trying to keep up with the chat.
It's certainly become clear to me in this discussion that we have there's still some work to be done about the differences between the legal code in the licenses and the community expectations. And I think that I said this in a talk a couple of months ago, that I think there's an elephant in the room about what is the intellectual merit of a data set? How does it contribute to an author's distinction and a researcher's distinction? The thing that gets you tenure. And I think that is something that hasn't been properly addressed yet.
I think a lot of us are trying to push the idea that, you know, data is a first-class research object, and if you've put in time and effort to curate and collect and publish a data set, that should be recognized as an important contribution to research. I don't know that we're there yet, but I think
Yes,
we're certainly pushing to that
and
direction.
this is where I'm hoping that in the second iteration of this call, in 12 hours time, Mark Parson will be online. He and Peter Fox published a paper a few years ago where they asked the question whether publication is the right metaphor for sharing data. And it would be really interesting to reflect on that, whether publication, in which cases publication is the right metaphor for sharing data.
Mark, I don't know if you've seen, but there's a question in the chat for you that I'm also interested in, which is, do you track the relative impact of republished data? So say via traffic and usage to Dryad data in Figshare compared to traffic to Dryad directly?
No, but that's the fun stuff we could do. I know, so we have citation counts differently, which I believe we can give back to the audience. A lot of people will look for citation counts in the reference list. When some preliminary research we did showed that 7 out of 8 links to mentions of data sets or non-traditional research outputs in papers were in the method section or in the data availability section. And so you only get 1/8 of the citations. And if you're looking to have, be encouraging researchers that they're going to get more credit for their research if they make their data available, you know, there's papers saying they'll get 25% more citations to the paper, which is great. But if you want to say data is a first class output and you're going to get the same, you're going to get citations for them, we want to share as much of that impact as possible. So we look in the full text of articles, and so we have higher numbers of citations that we're happy to share with the community through these other things. But again, we have an API where anyone can check those things. This is something that they can do now using our API, which is openly available, instead of having to build a connector to 5 repositories themselves. I saw there's also a question. My RDA people mostly discuss opinions depending on their role. I consider myself an RDA people, by the way. What about your role? Totally fact underpinned. I'm not 100% sure. My role is the CEO of a service provider. So my input in this is more focused on what librarians want than maybe the researchers want. But we do a state of open data survey every year, trying to find out what the researchers want and use that as ways to build better tools for researchers or to get better engagement with open data.
Looking at the time, I think we should start wrapping up the discussion to then briefly talk about what we're going to do next. And do you want to add any last words to the discussion?
I think if I could say anything, I see Francoise in the chat has pointed out one of the things that I mentioned earlier, that we discuss a lot about what researchers' needs for recognition are, but it's important not to forget that repositories also need recognition and credits for the work that they do in curating and making data available. And I think that's one thing that possibly underpins a bit of the emotions that arose around the situation in December on Twitter, is making sure that repositories get appropriate credit, whatever form that credit may take.
Yes, and I think one of the things that could be tasked for future group is to work out a more faceted scenario of different users, personas that are involved with the processes happening around sharing data in different ways. So this is certainly something to look at. Leslie?
No, I just put in the bottom, you know, don't forget there's also the funders. They're part of the picture now.
Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, I just echo Leslie's comment there that I think the funders are the biggest part of the picture now. The idea that you can motivate researchers to share their data because of promised, career benefits in the future. But ultimately, this has got to the point where globally funders are saying, well, we pay for this research. You have to make it available because we pay for it and we want to see the impact of it. And I think that is going to have a bigger impact in the next 3 years than anything else. And so that is going to be an interesting kind of angle around compliance and things like this. And they also pay for the repositories. Great point, Francois.
Yes.
They have the money. They pay for the researchers. They pay for the repositories.
Well, yeah, certainly the open access to research data from publicly funded research was the original line that has now evolved into a bigger story over the past 16 years now. But yeah, this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. The question is now, what do we do with this? Leslie certainly doesn't want to start another group, be it interest or working, but maybe there are others. So Leslie says, no way. Yeah, I can understand. We don't have to resolve this now, but it's something that there's another round of the same talks, probably different discussion in about 12 hours time when we repeat the session. And then please put your names and email addresses into the shared document with the notes. I haven't had the time to look at what was happening there, but I think we don't have all your names and addresses if you want to be involved in the future development around this topic. And we will be asking the question of, was this birds of a feather meeting a once-off? Or does this spark an interest group in RDA that will work on more specific aspects that have been raised in the discussions?
Could I just add something? We actually have 63 names in, which is in bags. At one stage, there's 68 now. We had 86. Could I be blunter and ask the question? Is there anyone who feels strongly enough about this that they would like to be a chair and help take this forward? Because I don't want to do another one at the moment. I'm just sort of trying to reduce the number and do the ones I've got properly. And that's meaning working group interest groups.
I mean, I find this a really interesting and important topic. I think the question would be, in what practical way would we take it forward? Like, what would be the focus of an interest group or a working group? What would we actually practically be trying to achieve? It's been a really fantastic discussion, and thank you so much for inviting me to contribute. And thank you to everyone on the chat. But yeah,
The trouble is, so Jens and I've got that with the versioning project working group.
Yeah,
I think you actually get these things off the ground if couple of people actually say, yes, I feel strongly enough about this. It may or may not work, but I'm willing to help get this started.
And I think we had a pretty classical life cycle for the data versioning group, where we were members of the dynamic data citation working group and then decided, no, they're not actually solving our problems. There is still something that needs to be resolved. So we had a BoF on what is versioning, and from that we recognized that we need to do something. So we started an interest group and used that to focus onto a mission that we could then solve in the allotted 18 months. And that's where I think this topic of versioning has come to a close. If somebody wants to continue it, so they have to start something new. And this might be a new topic that I think if we want to continue, we could explore in an interest group.
Yes, I add one column to that participant table. If people can indicate their interests in that table, then
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me see, did I miss anything here? Next steps. Well, if there is a group, we will certainly publish something. Maybe something else happens. And that was it. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you again to the speakers. Thank you to the audience. We will probably have to spend days sifting through the discussion to work out all the points. And this has been great. So wherever you are in the world, stay safe, stay healthy, have a great day, afternoon, evening, night, and maybe you will join us in about 12 hours time for the next round, or maybe in another forum where we continue our discussion. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks for hosting, Jan.
Thank you for organizing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.